with regards to how actually humanists, as non-religious practitioners, are experienced within traditionally faith-based healthcare chaplaincy teams. Now, originally, I just want to read out a quote to you. So when I was looking further into the different quotes that were collected from the survey data, there was one that stood out to me, and it was in particular with regards to that those that were religious are kind of like the omnivores, they can eat everything. But those that are non-religious or humanists are actually the vegetarians, eat a little bit but not the meat part. So just want to read out a little bit of text here, just to get your juices flowing. So imagine that you're invited to a dinner party around the 1950s. The wife of the house traditionally cooks a nice hot roast dinner and makes the meat juices seen by enhancing it with herbs and spices and creating it into a nice thick gravy. You arrive there for the year 2022 and then remember that you weren't asked any dietary requirements, but you're sure that they'll understand that you prefer to not eat meat. You're warmly received into the foyer. Before you're sat at the dinner table, you spot the pot roast in the oven from the corner of your eye. You think it's only polite to say that you don't prefer to eat meat, as you are a vegetarian, and assure that the dinner size will suffice for a nice meal. There's deafening silence. The ladle, which the lady of the house held tightly to scoop the gravy into the serving dish, clatters on the floor, and the echo penetrates the empty bellies, which slowly become filled with disillusionment. You don't eat meat? Says the lady of the house, with a shocked look on her face. No, I don't. Sorry, you reply, thinking this wasn't such a big deal, as there are many others you know who are vegetarian. Slowly the question starts. You start feeling you must defend why you chose to be vegetarian, rather than to follow the mainstream meat eaters, whilst you're still standing in the foyer. The warm welcome experience of just a few minutes ago seems to have been replaced with a chilled breeze, and you feel you don't really fit in. Questions arise in your head whether to stay or go, or hope for some understanding. Maybe if you explain why you are enough, they'll come to terms. But in the end, you are vegetarian, and they are meat eaters. Can we overcome this difference? And this quote led me to actually write this paragraph, because not that I'm only vegetarian, I'm also a humanist. I've got a double whammy. So, yes.
I know you're really excited, but something that people are struggling to understand is you're a bit fast. Slow.
Yeah, sure, no problem. Can you hear me well enough in the back?
Yep.
Yes. Brilliant. So, with regards to the research that I conducted was solely around how humanists are slowly entering traditionally faith-based healthcare chaplaincy teams. Now, with regards to humanist chaplaincy in that sense, and I will refer to the term chaplaincy because it's widely known within the UK, although we might refer to ourselves as humanist pastoral carers. There's very little to no research around humanists. There's actually only one book that's been published 2 years ago from one of my colleagues, David Savage, and that's about it, what you can find. There's lots of articles that are written from across different kind of countries all over the world, in particular my mother country, the Netherlands, but very little is still known about the impact of humanists entering traditionally faith-based healthcare chaplaincy teams in the UK. The reason is because it's fairly new. So it's roughly around 8 years that it started to develop, and where humanists and in particular non-religious providers were entering these teams. And that's also due to the societal changes that we are seeing reflected within society. And with regards to that, you would see, for instance, that there is a decline within religious mainstream attendees. But as you probably will hear from Linda Woodhead on Thursday, it doesn't particularly mean that people are becoming less religious. There is still that spiritual inclination, and there could be also spiritual existential needs for those that might identify as non-religious. And it's equally as important to have that tradition represented. And that's how humanist pastoral care came into existence within the UK. Now you see some of the headlines that was also mentioned within my introduction, and it was something that I highlighted in the panel discussion just before this keynote. I was quite surprised when I was appointed as the first lead chaplain at Buckinghamshire Healthcare NHS Trust in 2018, and again last year as the head of chaplaincy at Sheffield Teaching Hospitals, that this was such uncommon news that a humanist as head of service was such a big thing to pick up in media. This didn't just go within the UK, it was advertised across European lines, Russia, China even, and different kinds of European countries that publicized lots of different articles about it. And with that came lots of different opinions. I'm highlighting that not because I like to see my face in the paper, I absolutely resent these photos, by the way, but because I got lots of response, made it be positive or very negative. I received letters that were threatening letters that I will go to hell, that I'm the Antichrist, and that I will burn for my sins. And this wasn't just online trolling, it was a personal letter I received by post, sent to my previous trust to say Jesus died for you. And I believed it about how to get to heaven, but only from the USA. So I could only do that apparently from the United States.
Amen.
Thank you very much. This was particularly alarming, of course, for me, as I was quite naive, was just thinking, I'm a chaplain like all of you guys in the room. And all of a sudden, there was this media outburst and lots of feelings. And then I remembered two things that we tend to avoid, right? Religion and politics, and particularly religion, because how we define ourselves has everything to do with what we believe in. It's part of our identity, it's part of our values. So press some serious buttons that all of a sudden this non-religious person, and also the title did not help, non-religious person is overviewing priests of some sort, was all of a sudden in charge of a chaplaincy department, because how should a non-religious person be even in chaplaincy to begin with? And I got loads of those questions. So with regards to that, so I've got some Dutch colleagues here that I just identified actually in the previous session. But in Holland, it's very normalized within society that there is such a thing as humanist pastoral carers. We call it differently. It's more like spiritual caregivers or practitioners or counselors. We don't have that sort of chaplaincy. But here in the UK it isn't, because we're still quite, of course, embedded within Christian society. But if we look a bit further into the social changes, you do see from the previous census, and the new one still to be shared, of course, that 53% of the population identifies non-religious, and higher even amongst those that are 18 to 25-year-olds, that's around 71%. And it doesn't mean, for instance, that therefore religion is at stake, and that's what I constantly have to argue, that I'm not the Antichrist, I'm not going to push you out of a job. It means that we also have to represent those that have non-religious beliefs, and that is equal and has an equal footing to any other faith and belief within the group that we have to represent. Now, within healthcare, there's such a thing as chaplaincy guidelines, and that was published first in 2015, where it included the non-religious provision, which was a massive leap, because previously there was no such thing as the non-religious being included. And you still have the terminology such as religious or faith, but often non-religious beliefs are left out. So it was a real turning point, and it was actually recognized there's such a thing as the spiritual existential layers of somebody who might have non-religious beliefs. The way I'm saying it, non-religious beliefs, is to be better phrased than all faith and none, or nils, as they're called in prison. People can have different non-religious beliefs, maybe atheists, humanists, freethinkers, agnostics, that fall under that remit. So just as a conceptualization there. Now, there are new guidelines are coming out soon, and hopefully that will show that inclusivity as well as non-religious provision. But again, I'm not here to just advocate or proselytize on based on my own non-religious beliefs. I'm here to advocate on the basis of that all faiths and beliefs should be represented and should be able to provide that like-minded care for those who want and need it. And we often have interchanged kind of support that we provide within our team, and we rely heavily on that to refer onwards, as well as those that build relationships with those of different faiths and beliefs. We are there to support them person-centered. Now, with regards to the research, I conducted at first a survey research, which was mixed methods, specifically around the lived experience, for which I used thematic analysis. And I'll zoom through this because it's mostly around research and how it was set up, but just for you to have a bit of an understanding. Now, thematic analysis really tends to sell for the lived experiences, where you can look into different themes that arise within the data that you collect. And what I did was send out that survey questionnaire to those that identified as non-religious beliefs and humanists, as well as those that would recognize themselves as being faith-based. So I didn't say religious chaplains, because it's a very controversial term. And as I was corrected by my previous colleagues in Buckinghamshire, they would say that they would be faith-based, but not that they would see themselves as religious. So hence, faith-based versus those that are non-religious chaplains. Now, with regards to how I actually started to recruit, it was very much about that people needed to be in practice within healthcare, speaking the English language, and of course have that experience within healthcare. In total, we had 42 people that responded from the non-religious side, and 54 from the faith-based background, maybe Christian, Muslim, Buddhist, predominantly Christian backgrounds, because we do realize most of the healthcare chaplaincy is still in that way Christian. So, I'll skip the ethics. I do want to say with regards to ethics that of course I'm very much aware that I'm an insider researcher because I have lived those experiences. So I have to keep a reflexive journal myself about my own assumptions because I do have them, of course, working and encountering difficulties within my own field. And I also had somebody, for instance, that was able to check from a different side of that faith-based perspective with, is this right, the way I'm phrasing it? Is this right, the way my thought process is constructed? Now, with regards to a literature review that I did to actually scope out what's already out there within the UK context, and what, for instance, supplements the survey results, the literature review was quite thin again, because there's very little published around humanist practices within the UK. So what did come out of it, most coming from a Christian perspective, was 3 topics that emerged from literature. One was, of course, that it recognized the shifting landscape of healthcare chaplaincy and specifically reflected the journey of healthcare chaplaincy and the recent changes of welcoming those that were non-religious and those that didn't specifically have faith in a higher power or God. It also said that it was the need of supporting over half of the population in existential spiritual needs outside of that religious framework. These changes also led to topic 2, which was the worries about chaplaincy funding. And let's be honest, I'm a head of service myself. Funding is thin, and we're always worried about where can we find more funding, and to also advocate that chaplaincy, spiritual, existential, and religious care provision is needed and necessary. And that's a constant case that you were making in whatever kind of sector you may work in. But there were worries that were tied with regards to the non-religious coming in. So the worries with regards to recruitment and funding streams was when those non-religious were going to be recruited, that this might retract from jobs for the faith-based practitioners. And they were already struggling in an ever-shrinking chaplaincy budget. So how is that going to impact? More people at the table, but perhaps less people that could actually apply for a job because of that extra flavor at the table. And then the last theme that emerged from the literature was the challenges of working in multi-belief teams, and addressed that the use of Christian language and other barriers that exclude the non-religious. Now this is something that's in flux, and it was part of the panel discussion as well with reconstructing chaplaincy professions. And language is always ever evolving as we actually learn from each other. And that's why we have these kind of dialogues over the course of these days. But although the non-religious were becoming part of the teams, the service provisioning colleagues were maybe not always as ready with regards to inclusive language and practice to accommodate all beliefs. There were also, coming from literature, a lot of misconceptions with those that might be faith-based towards those that were non-religious, and prejudice as well about persons with non-religious worldviews. Some were even very aggressive rhetoric with regards to Humanists UK, which is the accrediting body for those that are humanist pastoral carers in the UK, and also those that would criticize those practices. However, and that was something that was really an eye-opener for myself as well with conducting those surveys. When we look at the survey results, it turns out that those assumptions are also experienced on the faith-based side, and may that be non-religious or faith-based. Assumptions is a human nature, and we all make them. And we've all made them already from different people we saw today, that first split instance until we start a dialogue, and then we can alter our assumptions. So, when we look at the surveys, what themes came out of that? So the first theme is the chaplain's role. I asked them openly about how they would actually see what the chaplain does, so how they would identify. And that led as a chaplain as professional and working in institutions. The unique selling points is the second one of chaplaincy. So what are the similarities to other support services, maybe it be psychology, staff well-being, for instance, or those other emotionally based work services, and the differences. So how do we differentiate as a chaplaincy practice from those other services that might be quite, near what we do? The third one was the experience of a multi-belief setting, and may there be similarities and opportunities, or the differences and challenges that might impose. And fourth was the chaplaincy support in practice. So I presented a case study for people to respond to. So we could actually look at the structure of how those that were faith-based as well as those who were non-religious would encounter in a specific patient interaction, and how that would be from opening to themes discussed to the closing of that particular conversation. Now, with regards to the themes of the chaplain as professional, most of the participants described the chaplain as a professional, which included the professional attitudes and skills they could bring to their role, which very much linked with the identity of what a chaplain looks like. The role was also described as accommodating all faiths and beliefs, and this was across the park. The results also highlight staff, family, and care support rather than just the focus on patient care. And some also highlighted their worldview with an example of promoting non-religious care, for instance. They furthermore described how conducting rites and rituals and services were part of the identity of a chaplain, as well as a requirement or expectation from a chaplain. And those rites and rituals include those of faith or non-religious beliefs. And there's some quotes here, I won't go through all of them, and I will provide slides if you want to look at them further. But reading out one of them, it's around providing spiritual, religious, and pastoral care to patients, family, friends, and staff of all faiths and none of a religious participant. There you've got somebody that says, being 100% with another person who wants your attention and interaction at a time of discomfort, disease, or disorientation, recognizing their vulnerability and the realities of their lived experience in a way that values and respects their individual choices and interpretations. So you can see the different kinds of interpretations of what it is like to be a chaplain as a professional. With regards to working in institutions, so how the chaplain relates to working in their work environment, it was discussed that it was closely linked to their work context, and outside of their chaplain's conversation with service users, certain topics came out of the survey revolved around working with key stakeholders, such as those support services. It was also highlighted their work in relation to working with local faith and belief communities, because we can't always provide all of it, so we need to closely have this relationship with key stakeholders. And holistic care was promoted to potential service users. There was also a training element for other healthcare professionals about spiritual provision, and to train them further in what that means with regards to holistic care. Finding there are also some challenges with regards to unanimity of how the profession should be named. And there were various concepts and descriptions provided in the open text box to try and capture who we are, as in how we call ourselves, and what do we do. And I just want to show you that. So just have a look here. So, working institutions, how professions should be named. So, the title and the frequency. Can you see how many different ways people describe themselves? So there's no unanimity with regards to how you can actually refer to oneself. You still have that chaplain, as you can see in the second column, is the most popular one with 41 people subscribing to that word chaplain. And then you've got different degrees of pastoral, spiritual, religious specific kind of connotations, or faith belief specific, it could be reverend, for instance, or humanist volunteer, or Muslim spiritual care provider, or those that actually would just look at the support specifically, such as emotional welfare support worker, or volunteer, or ward visitor. And some that just avoided it altogether and just said, my name is Lindsay. So many different ways, isn't there, how you can actually refer to yourself. And yet, we all fall under the same umbrella. So there's some identity crisis there. So it's not just with regards to humanists entering, it's also with regards to the identity of chaplaincy overall that came out of this survey. Some themes about our unique selling points and similarities of other support services was, for instance, those counseling skills that might come around, such as communication, reflection, being non-judgmental, or also providing well-being support to service users. That was part of the nature of chaplaincy. Also, the connection between the professional and the person in front of them was mentioned in the similar experience within those counseling type professions as well as chaplaincy, and that it works with other services in the institution, by, for instance, referring onwards and working alongside with them in multidisciplinary teams. Here you've got some of those quotes, for instance. So there may be some crossover in that any human being can come alongside and support another human being. Sometimes the support offered might be similar in terms of pastoral or psychological support. Or there are, however, overlaps, because both for pastoral therapists and psychotherapists, listening and engagement skills are essential to create a trusting and meaningful relationship. And then the last one, chaplaincy should be distinct as a profession, yet be able to work alongside and with allied healthcare professionals, in short AHP, counseling, psychology, to ensure a multidisciplinary care for patients. So you can see the similarities there. But how do we then differ from that? So the differences that I meant was predominantly the spiritual domain of working, such as engaging with the worldview, the values, belief systems of those service users, maybe in this case, patients, family, relatives, and staff. But for instance, as well for in education, your students. Participants also describe themselves as skilled professionals in this domain of pastoral, spiritual, and religious care, experts in the field, knowing their business of that worldviewing. And also included the focus and facilitation of rituals and rites, of specific faith and belief practices, which often also refer to end-of-life care. Many also indicated the different structures of chaplaincy in comparison to, for instance, counseling, because most participants spoke of the absence of a medical or a clinical stance, and that the structure was flexible, open, and focused on the moment, as opposed to other support services, which could also be very tricky, as we know, because you never really have a cut of time. In relation to the experienced absence of a medical or clinical stance, the person-centered focus was often seen by participants as an area innate to chaplaincy work, and it was often phrased positively that there wasn't such a rigid structure as experienced within those counseling-type professions. And there are some of those quotes again. So for instance, it's only in that moment, non-uniform, outside of treatment plans and medical procedures, and there's no attempt to confront, interpret, solve, or explain. Chaplains walk alongside and take time to get answers, but to allow the person to ask them. Chaplains can explore spirituality in a non-invasive way. No needles or drugs. We're not a commissioned service. We have freedom to walk alongside service users for as long as they need us, rather than for a fixed number of sessions. We're able to address their needs using their own framework of reference, rather than by a particular approved therapy or technique, which we impose on them, unlike the way a psychotherapist must work. Those were some of those differences. Now, how about working in a multi-belief setting? Similarities and opportunities, there are plenty of them, as well as, of course, the differences and challenges. The similarities are, non-religious as well as faith-based colleagues describe similarities about how they've all offered care to those requesting support, and the different skills that they use for that as well, such as listening, pastoral skills, reflecting skills, exploration of a person's belief, being alongside somebody in times of need, and facilitating that existential spiritual conversation to explore that growth. They also describe the aim to work generically, which is a term that's conflicted. I'm very much aware of that. Some also say open chaplaincy, but to provide, regardless of one's own faith and belief, that specific care to those needing it. And of course, if there is such a like-minded request, refer onwards. As well as seeing the similarities, faith-based and non-religious chaplains also saw the opportunities in having each other as colleagues. They spoke about the benefit of having that multi-belief provision, which included topics around equality, diversity, and inclusion in chaplaincy, such as providing that like-minded care, having no religious bias, and changing chaplaincy assumptions by promoting the service as something more than just responding to religious inquiry, and actually learning from each other by seeing those different kinds of faiths and beliefs represented. There was a great benefit demonstrated in collaborating with each other, and especially the support and allyship that they experienced of learning from each other with other backgrounds, and how that can lead to understanding and how to refer to one another within this multi-belief setting. Also, they spoke very fondly about the willingness to work together can lead to a positive outcome. So that sounds all amazing, of course, and you see all of these quotes as well. So for instance, It's about raising their awareness to the large number of non-religious people and patients that are met, that non-religious meaning is a reality, can be found, that non-religious people can be kind, and that listening to people to find out what matters to them is crucial. But for instance as well, about I do not currently work alongside any humanist or non-religious chaplaincy colleagues, but much of my work is not explicitly religious, so much of it would not be differently delivered at all. When people explore their beliefs with me, they can do so openly, whatever they are. So you can see that similarity seep through within those kind of quotes. When we look, however, at the differences, and you can probably imagine some of them already, you could see that particularly it was with regards to their faith and how they influenced their way of working. So faith-based chaplains described of course the presence of God and how they approach spiritual care and motivation for their work. Non-religious raised the same differences relating to how their faith-based colleagues work in comparison and how their non-religious worldview actually impacted on their motivation and working with the absence of God or a higher power. Non-religious described that they were feeling free from religious assumptions and without a religious agenda, allegiances, doctrines, and could therefore provide person-centered care without any bias. But both faith-based and non-religious chaplains refer to rites and rituals. Faith-based spoke about how they can provide these, whilst non-religious counterparts can't. So you can see the differences there already. Now, with regards to, for instance, celebrancy, which is the expression of rites and rituals from a non-religious tradition, that is a different training within Humanist UK. So you're trained as a humanist pastoral care or a humanist chaplain or a celebrant. You can do both, but it's not immediately assumed when you are a humanist chaplain that you are also a celebrant. So often we find ourselves, for instance, within a non-religious provision, that those that haven't yet done the celebrancy training are perhaps a bit at loss when doing weddings, funerals, baby namings, for instance, those non-religious provisions. And that is something that is currently changing, but that's why you see the last kind of theme that is emerged. So often those that are in a volunteer point of view, as a non-religious provider, that they might not always feel equipped to provide those rites and rituals with regards to the non-religious provision. Now, with regards to the challenges faith-based chaplains experience with working with non-religious colleagues, there were also operational challenges, and I get this question a lot about recruiting someone who can't perform Christian rites and rituals and leaving gaps in their rotas. Challenges also related to what non-religious can provide due to the absence of a faith in God, and with this, how they can meet the demand for those of faith in response to faith inquiries. I understand this is a real concern. Of course, it was also narrated from that originally traditionally based Christian perspective of how chaplaincy has emerged over time. Faith-based chaplains describe specific challenges they have with non-religious colleagues around their assumptions in faith-based colleagues. So you can see here the assumptions from the non-religious towards those faith-based. And also the negative attitudes of non-religious colleagues were discussed, even the proselytizing of their non-religious views, the failure to acknowledge the importance of religion, or to even undermine religion. A few comments were made about the non-religious terminology and its provision, along with the comment that it's inaccurate to claim the whole non-religious service user group as their own. And some faith-based chaplains didn't feel that there was added value of humanist chaplains joining their teams, or felt that humanism couldn't provide any meaning. And others perhaps highlighted that there was insufficient training amongst their non-religious colleagues. Now, when you look at those that were non-religious, you can see that often they felt that there were Christian allegiances, such as challenges applying to paid roles. So feeling disadvantaged that often there are vacancies out, for instance, that specifically ask for a Christian or a minister of faith, or, for instance, particularly around the administration of religious rites that are often phrased in a Christian way, and therefore excluding those that might be of non-religious backgrounds. They also described challenges they experienced with their faith-based colleagues about that they felt that they felt distrusting or suspicious towards them and not respect or value their work because they were non-religious. Some felt treated unequally in comparison to their faith counterparts, as well as that they couldn't express their non-religious worldviews. They may have been as simple as, for instance, not allowed to, for instance, say of their name badge that they were of a non-religious background or a humanist background. Or actually that they couldn't mention it in conversation with the patient. And sometimes that really led to some loneliness as well, feeling all alone and not supported because of that non-religious worldview. Other comments were that their skills, which we saw in the previous section, and training was not recognized by their faith-based chaplains. And they also expressed that a challenge was conflicting worldviews and an entitlement of those of Christian faith, which excludes other beliefs, and encourages a faith-specific focused agenda, as well as the potential to proselytize. So we see this word twice, faith-based as well as non-religious. Non-religious also mentions that there were assumptions faith-based colleagues made about the non-religious who were very unhelpful. And some phrases were captures around how non-religious chaplains viewed their faith-based counterparts and how they worked from their faith-based perspective. And while some felt that there was allyship and support, those who really received allyship felt that they benefited from it, but those who didn't had a real difficult time. So you can see here some of those quotes. So the difference will be in being able to offer religious care and perhaps explore spiritual care for a faith-based chaplain. Non-religious person, I have no scriptures or prayers to fall back on. I must find all resources in myself. Again, a non-religious chaplain. I am focused on them. I have no agenda, no allegiance to religion, the precepts of which I may feel a need to meet. Now, it's like the difference between an omnivore and a vegetarian. The omnivore eats meat, but can include the whole of the vegetarian diet. And for some, the patients, family, or staff, religious intervention is crucial. Most night calls are for specific religious reasons, prayer for the dying or last rites. So you can see that real tension. Again, with regards to, for instance, the challenges that were experienced, is that there were assumptions, falsely about what I do. Our humanist volunteer chaplain in a meeting to our palliative care team said, the difference between me and the other chaplains is that I do not approach anyone with an agenda. In this he showed he had more of an agenda than I. I think there can be prejudice and assumption on all sides. Yet the best of us, religious or humanists, are open, respectful, and person-centered. I get on very well with a humanist volunteer, and personally would advocate for a paid post. Like all of us, when we work with others, debate, talk, and get to know each other, assumptions change and respect grows. Now, lastly, just one more. Sometimes colleagues do not have a deeper understanding of humanism and see it as atheism and see it as much less deep than their faith. I feel some of my religious colleagues rush in to give religious support because this is linked to their own needs and identity, but they often don't consider nuances of denomination and belief practices as well as longer-term support. Can you see a trend emerging here? There's lots of different assumptions about how we work with each other and also generalizations there. So when we actually looked at the case study, it was rather interesting after collating all of those quotes and feedback, because when it came down to actually approaching somebody and engage within a pastoral spiritual conversation, there were so many similarities and barely any differences, whilst we had very different worldviews, because it was predominantly person-centered. So when you looked at the description of what they would describe that they provide and what they wouldn't provide within that chaplaincy context, you see that there was a very concise kind of overview of that. Chaplaincy support was able for somebody to speak out, to provide that spiritual and religious support and pastoral, that it was confidential, it was non-judgmental, just a listening ear, and visiting the wards. What they didn't provide, for instance, was not preaching, not religious if not wanted, not giving advice, solutions, or platitudes, and there was a non-medical stance. Some participants explained the reason why they came to see this person, and they varied from mentioning if they were just visiting the area, or if they were referred by a member of staff to check in on them, and if they just generally wanted some support. They often would also check with the patient whether they would be happy to partake in a conversation, so awaiting that consent and that verbal and nonverbal communication after asking how the person felt, and if they were happy to speak to them to receive some support. The end of the conversation was never as clear as the start of the conversation, as most chaplains indicated that open-ended way of working, which we saw most of the time was seen as positive, because it wasn't boxed in like the psychotherapeutic engagements, where you only had, for instance, 60 minutes and you have to wrap up. So it was a very open-ended support. And lastly as well, it was lots of skills such as paraphrasing, summarizing, reflecting back about what was said, and very much staying closely, walking alongside the story of that particular individual. And these are some examples that I will share with you later. Now, other themes that came to the foreground that was explored within that case study was the emotional spiritual domain in the widest sense of the word that they belong to. Also the worldviews and beliefs, feelings, even the identity that was linked, for instance, to that world viewing and the feelings that they were experiencing, and exploring that further support. So did they, for instance, have family members, friends, a community to refer onwards to, or did they, for instance, want further support from the chaplaincy service? Now, with regards to these survey results, they're far from actually finished and polished up results, because this is just a start by peeking into what our identity as chaplains are. And actually, it emerged as something way bigger than just how will it work with non-religious people entering traditionally faith-based healthcare chaplaincy teams. Actually, what it signals to me is there's a lot still to be explored with regards to the identity of chaplaincy. So I'd like to look further into interviews for the next phase of my own research. But I think as well for us all together during this week, we are starting that conversation that has never finished nor will never end around how we want chaplaincy to grow. And we can only do that together. We can't do that in silence. Now, with regards to the reflections and discussions that I'd like to leave you with, because I'm aware of time and I don't want to rush any of you as well for any kind of dinner options, is that I, of course, because of the insider perspective, have my own assumptions and my own biases coming into it. Especially the story I told you at the beginning about me coming into that chaplaincy practice as a non-religious person, getting all those comments, letters, and very nasty engagements. Actually, there is a lot of allyship as well. And I just want to stipulate that I wouldn't be here today without that allyship and support. So it was very soothing for me as well to see that come up in results, that allyship, if that is provided, is a real support for people to grow, regardless of what faith and belief, and we have to support each other in that. Now, when you go deep into how groups experience each other as colleagues, it appears there are a lot of assumptions made on both sides, as we saw, and that mostly it was actually back to a bad encounter with a colleague from a different worldview. They all kind of expressed their dissatisfaction about not being heard or acknowledged, maybe that be faith-based or non-religious, for instance, and that sometimes it was dismissed the importance of faith, sometimes it was dismissed that both non-religious backgrounds could provide meaning and purpose. But there were those assumptions on both sides. They all seemed to struggle with how to call themselves as professionals, but they were very similar in how they described their practices to be, and also their approach in the case study was similar. So actually, what is actually going on here? There seems to be still a lot of questions unanswered. And I think the majority of what has actually happened here is to open bare with what we might think of each other, but actually exploring what we do within healthcare chaplaincy rather than what we do different as chaplains because of different worldviews. Now, to help support change in chaplaincy, becoming more inclusive and embracing non-religious colleagues, faith-based chaplains can become more aware with regards to that originally rooted in Christianity, and to provide an allyship, because we need that allyship for us to be able to grow within the equality, diversity, and inclusion approach within any kind of chaplaincy setting. And then if we're able to actually include all of those different kinds of faiths and beliefs, provide that like-minded care, and have that equal stance regardless of faith and belief, I think we can finally move forward into that 21st century, where we need to support each other. Thank you so much.
Lindsay, thank you so much. I am aware of time and we did start a little bit late. Is there a burning question for Lindsay? I'm going to give you one. Oh, look out. That's the first hand up. That's the first
I'll
hand
give
up.
the nice line.
No, I need you on this because we're recording and all those sorts of interesting things.
Can we get a copy of the slides?
Yes.
Okay, that was a really short question. All right, one more. Hang on. That's it. Come on, meet me halfway.
Hello, I'm also from the Netherlands, and my background is that I just identify as atheist, and now more non-identification receiver. Now I just identify as atheist is now much more non-identifying strong to this practice, and I understand you because. But looking back on the time that I identified as atheist, I feel like some of my peers who went to Mecca, and me and my friends who went to Spain who drank a lot, and was very much also ritualistic and also beliefs and how science will explain everything, and even atheism could be a religion. And so I think when we talk about humanism, I think non-religious, but there could also still be a lot of rituals, and so that's the question, like, why the non-religious?
Yes. So the reason why I'm speaking of non-religious, and that is a political term within the UK. So within Humanists UK, we had to set up, of which I'm the chair, the non-religious pastoral support network, which accredits humanist pastoral carers to actually go out and apply for jobs, basically. The reason why it was called the non-religious pastoral support network is because when about 8 years ago we started knocking on doors, whether it be prisons or healthcare, people said, we'll give you a call when a humanist comes in. That never happens. So to actually be able to provide that non-religious provision, may it be atheist, agnostic, free thinker, or any other kind of identification on those non-religious beliefs that were also represented through Humanists UK, we set up that non-religious pastoral support network. Far from perfect that the language lends itself to none, because that's something that we want to avoid. But that is something that has arisen also with the panel discussion, that often because of me being a humanist, I have to define what I'm not within the chaplaincy field rather than what I am. And that's something that we're still having to reconstruct together.
Wonderful. Thank you. Lindsay, thank you for sharing. Okay, where are we going to from now? Bearing in mind that it is 3:58 and we have some timings to make. And I actually have received the WhatsApp, so I can